"Do not shut down any investigative leads." These 7 words, entered by hand in the narrow margin of a classified Central Intelligence Agency briefing memorandum, would eventually dismantle one of the most carefully protected political narratives of the modern era. The handwriting did not belong to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Rather, it represented a precise summary of the president's verbal instructions, recorded by John Brennan during a high-stakes intelligence briefing and subsequently annotated on his personal files. This definitive response from Barack Obama had been systematically redacted from every single declassified document released to the public, sealed away from congressional oversight committees, and completely withheld from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court for nearly a decade. The absolute secrecy surrounding this executive directive endured until Tulsi Gabbard, a combat veteran whose own government had systematically placed her name on a domestic terrorist watch list for articulating her perspectives on national television networks, read the unredacted text aloud inside a crowded congressional hearing room. Sitting a mere 12 feet away from the witness table, the 44th President of the United States maintained a completely unmoving, stoic posture. His hands remained resting on his knees, and his expression mirrored the practiced presidential composure he had displayed across thousands of international events over a 30-year career. Yet beneath that carefully managed facade, the foundational myth of an entirely scandal-free presidency went completely dark. What unfolded next would fundamentally alter the historical evaluation of his administration, initiating a sequence of events that began hours earlier when the former executive entered a hearing room he assumed was safely within his institutional control. The high-stakes Congressional Assembly was officially titled Oversight of the Intelligence Community's Domestic Surveillance Programs. On a humid Wednesday morning, the House Judiciary Committee hearing room inside the Rayburn House office building had reached its maximum capacity long before the opening gavel. The gallery rows had been densely packed, filled with senior administrative staffers, federal legal counsels, and an expansive media contingent. No one outside the senior Democratic caucus leadership was aware that the former commander-in-chief would be physically present inside the chamber. Barack Obama entered the room through the primary gallery doors, flanked by a specialized Secret Service protection detail and a former senior administrative aide who currently managed operations at his private foundation. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit with an open collar, a deliberate omission of a necktie that had become his standard post-presidential uniform, visually conveying a message of elder statesman status untethered from the daily restrictions of governance, yet still carrying immense institutional gravity. His hair showed more prominent silver than during his 2 terms in the Oval Office, but his signature unhurried. Confident walk remained completely unchanged. The walk of an executive who had entered thousands of rooms and assumed immediate authority over every one of them. The gallery recognized his profile instantly. A reverential murmur spread through the crowded benches, not the surprised gasp of an audience caught off guard, but the controlled, respectful reaction of individuals who had been quietly notified of his arrival, but remained unprepared for the physical reality of a former president walking through a legislative door. On the committee dais, Democratic members half stood in a collective display of institutional deference, while a junior representative from California involuntarily placed her hand over her heart. Obama moved through the lower gallery with his trademark calculated grace, offering subtle nods, touching the shoulders of former legislative colleagues, and displaying the familiar half-smile that had secured 2 national presidential elections. He settled into the center seat of the front row inside the designated VIP enclosure, positioned directly behind the witness table where every primary broadcast camera lens maintained a direct line of sight. His physical presence inside the chamber was the definitive message of the morning. Congressional leadership had quietly arranged his attendance through back-channel communications, announcing his participation to the Republican minority only hours prior, to serve as a living, authoritative defense of the sprawling intelligence apparatus he had managed and expanded. He was positioned to serve as an absolute institutional rebuke to the woman sitting directly at the witness table, a lawmaker whose tenure as the Director of National Intelligence was built on systematically declassifying the covert operations of the surveillance state, an individual who had been targeted by the very tracking databases his administration had codified, and a combat veteran who had exited his political party to manage the 18 intelligence agencies he considered his most enduring institutional legacy. Tulsi Gabbard sat at the center of the witness table. Having arrived at the facility alone, accompanied only by a solitary administrative staff aide who managed a standard cardboard file storage box, her posture was entirely rigid and unyielding. The container was not overtly thick or visually impressive, representing a simple archive box that could have contained routine administrative files. She wore a tailored dark navy suit with zero personal ornamentation, save for a small American flag pin positioned precisely on her lapel. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her face bore the specific, detached expression she had cultivated during her deployments to the Iraqi theater, an expression that reacted to absolutely nothing while remaining intensely observant of everything inside the room. She had clearly monitored the former president's arrival through the distorted reflection of the polished silver water pitcher resting on her desk, remaining completely motionless and refusing to turn her head as the assembly adjusted to accommodate his presence. The committee chairman officially brought the oversight hearing to order, and the primary sequence of testimonies proceeded under standard protocols. The true inflection point of the morning occurred approximately 40 minutes into the proceedings. A senior Democratic senator from Connecticut concluded a routine line of questions regarding administrative restructuring, but instead of surrendering his remaining time back to the chair, he turned directly to the committee leadership. He requested permission to yield his remaining 5 minutes to their distinguished gallery guest, President Obama, for the purpose of delivering a brief statement to the committee. The unexpected procedural handoff caused an immediate wave of whispered consultations across the Republican side of the dais. While highly irregular, the committee's senior counsel confirmed that yielding time to an invited gallery guest violated no explicit parliamentary rules, leaving the leadership with no legitimate grounds for objection that would not appear as an intentional effort to silence a former chief executive on live national television. Obama rose from his gallery chair with fluid ease, moving with the kinetic coordination that had consistently defined his public presentation. He walked directly to a standing committee microphone that had been positioned at the gallery rail rather than advancing to the primary witness table. The physical layout was entirely deliberate. He stood structurally elevated above the floor, looking directly down at the current Director of National Intelligence from an architectural posture of traditional authority. "Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the courtesy extended by the committee," Obama began, his voice immediately filling the chamber with the precise, resonant cadence that had defined his primary national addresses. "I believe it is imperative to address these matters with absolute transparency, because the American citizens deserve fundamental honesty rather than the selective declassification of sensitive documents designed to secure transient political points." He directed a cold, focused gaze downward toward Gabbard's position. Director Gabbard occupies that definitive chair today due to a philosophy of personal loyalty to one individual, rather than a fundamental commitment to the core tenets of our constitutional architecture. She has been positioned at the head of 18 individual intelligence agencies, not because she possesses a proven track record of managing complex national security infrastructure, but because she executed a calculated political endorsement at a strategic moment. The members of the majority caucus on the dais nodded in absolute synchronization as digital media networks updated their broadcasts in real time. "Let us be entirely transparent regarding the director's public record," Obama continued, his vocal delivery shifting into what his speechwriters routinely termed the pastoral register, the measured, sorrowful tone of a leader delivering an uncomfortable truth. She initiated unapproved meetings with foreign dictators who deployed chemical weapons against civilian populations without State Department authorization. She publicly praised individuals who compromised classified national security databases and fled to adversarial nations. Her subsequent enrollment on specialized travel screening watch lists was not an act of political retribution. It was the direct result of automated security protocols flagging highly irregular international travel patterns that any responsible screening framework is mandated to monitor. He straightened his posture against the rail, his voice carrying an expression of absolute institutional authority. "I served this nation as chief executive for 8 years. My primary constitutional mandate was the absolute protection of our domestic security. I authorized the targeted operation that eliminated Osama bin Laden, and I executed those heavy responsibilities in tandem with an intelligence community that I trusted implicitly, because I refused to utilize those agencies as a political weapon. I deployed them strictly as a protective shield for the Republic." Director Gabbard, with respect, you are not qualified for the chair you currently occupy. and the records you are presenting today are not evidence of systemic administrative wrongdoing. They represent the execution of a personal grudge. The immediate aftermath of the former president's statement was marked by a sharp wave of applause from the Democratic side of the committee dais. Several lawmakers rose to their feet in a synchronized display of institutional solidarity, while a general buzz of whispered commentary rippled through the public gallery benches. Barack Obama walked back to his designated seat within the VIP enclosure, with the exact same unhurried, graceful cadence that had characterized his entrance. He offered a brief nod to a staffer, adjusted his charcoal jacket, and allowed his familiar half-smile to return to his face. He sat down, completely re-establishing his composed, presidential posture. He had delivered what many in the room considered a masterclass in executive defense. Throughout the entire performance, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard had remained completely motionless at the witness table. She did not alter her posture, she did not look backward toward the gallery rail, and she did not offer any visible reaction to the sharp criticisms leveled against her qualifications and her character. The committee chairman waited for the applause to subside before striking his gavel against the wooden block, restoring a cold order to the Rayburn chamber. He directed his gaze downward toward the center table. Director Gabbard, you maintain the absolute right of response to the statements made by our gallery guest. Gabbard leaned forward slightly, reaching out to adjust the flexible neck of her microphone. The minor adjustment produced a sharp, metallic click that resonated clearly across the silent room, the loudest sound inside the chamber since the chairman's gavel. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," Gabbard began, her voice carrying a flat, steady precision that immediately commanded the room's attention. "I have no intention of addressing the personal characterizations or the political attacks put forward by the former president. He is entirely entitled to his personal opinion regarding my fitness for this office and my qualifications to lead the intelligence community. What I am going to address, however, are the empirical facts, because facts are the sole currency that the United States intelligence community is mandated to deal in." With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached into the standard cardboard file storage box positioned beside her chair. She bypassed the thicker files, extracting a single sheet of paper printed on official government letterhead. "The former president just confidently asserted to this committee that my placement on the Transportation Security Administration's domestic watch list was the direct result of automated security protocols flagging highly irregular international travel patterns that raised legitimate security concerns," Gabbard stated, holding the document up so that it was aligned with both the committee dais and the primary line of media broadcast cameras. "I would like to read the exact text from the actual administrative record." She adjusted her reading glasses and focused on the document. "This is an internal Department of Homeland Security memorandum generated by the Quiet Skies program manager, dated July 24, 2024. This specific directive explicitly requests my expedited enrollment into the Domestic Surveillance Tracking Framework. This document was classified under national security restrictions until my office finalized its formal declassification review for the explicit purpose of these oversight proceedings." She paused, ensuring that the room was entirely silent before reading the formal justification field, the administrative section mandated by federal law to outline the underlying threat matrix or national security risk posed by a targeted individual. "The justification field reads verbatim as follows," Gabbard announced, her voice echoing clearly through the Rayburn building. "Subject is a former member of Congress, a former presidential candidate, and a current political commentator who has systematically made statements critical of the current administration on national television networks. Subject's verified travel patterns include frequent domestic flights for the explicit purpose of media appearances and political assemblies." Gabbard set the document flat on the polished wooden table before her, her expression remaining entirely detached. "This internal Department of Homeland Security memorandum contains absolutely no mention of international terrorism. It references no active threat assessments, no validated intelligence reports, and no active law enforcement referrals. The explicit, documented justification for placing a 21-year combat veteran and a current public official on a domestic terrorist watch list was that she chose to exercise her First Amendment right to criticize the current administration on national television." She paused for several seconds, letting the raw text of the government memorandum settle heavily over the audience. When she spoke again, her vocal delivery shifted away from the detached precision of an administrative official, adopting a deeply personal authority that the traditional military register usually suppressed. I made the conscious decision to enlist inside the Hawaii Army National Guard in 2003, Gabbard stated, looking directly toward the committee dais. That was exactly 2 years following the catastrophic destruction of September 11th. I was 21 years old. I volunteered to deploy to the Iraqi theater in 2004, operating with a specialized medical unit attached to a field artillery brigade. I earned a combat medical badge while working inside structural field hospitals, directly treating soldiers who had been shot, who had been severely burned, and who were losing blood faster than our medical logistics could replace it. I subsequently deployed to Kuwait in 2008, serving as an active military police officer. I have worn the uniform of this country and served our nation for over 21 years. She then turned her face slightly, directing her gaze toward the gallery row where Obama sat. The domestic surveillance state that you built, the sprawling intelligence apparatus that expanded significantly under your executive tenure, the specialized Quiet Skies tracking program that was officially launched in 2010 under your Department of Homeland Security, and the secondary screening protocols that your administration implemented, that exact system was directly weaponized to place my name on a terrorist watch list because I delivered a political assessment on Fox News that an administrative official inside the White House found unpalatable. She detailed the operational reality of the surveillance targeting her personal life. My husband, Abraham, a civilian cinematographer who represents absolutely zero national security threats to this republic, was concurrently enrolled in the tracking database. Federal air marshals, highly trained law enforcement agents whose explicit constitutional mandate is the physical interdiction of actual hijacking threats on high-risk international routes, were systematically pulled off those critical international flights and reassigned to tail my physical movements on routine domestic flights from Nashville to Orlando. The room remained completely transfixed as she itemized the daily indignities of the surveillance state. For 6 consecutive months, every single instance of my arrival at an American airport resulted in immediate detention by federal agents. Every individual item inside my travel bags was forensically searched, and every inch of my physical person was subjected to invasive pat-downs. This process occurred for 30 to 45 minutes before every single flight I attempted to board, while the boarding pass in my hand was stamped with the explicit 4-letter designation, SSS. A woman who had voluntarily deployed to active combat zones to fight international terrorists was systematically classified as a suspected terrorist by her own government. Mr. President, this was executed under your ultimate authority. Not by you personally in the year 2024, but by the very system you constructed, the intelligence infrastructure you expanded, and the unchecked surveillance tools you created and left for every subsequent administration to inherit and deploy. In the front row of the gallery, Obama maintained his characteristic seated posture, his hands resting flat on his knees, his body open and relaxed, projecting the image of a seasoned executive observing a routine legislative proceeding. However, as the specific wording of the declassified DHS memorandum was entered into the official record, explicitly citing statements critical of the current administration as the baseline for a terrorist designation, his jaw executed a minor involuntary shift. It was not an aggressive clench of the teeth, but a subtle physical repositioning, the micro-movement of a public figure whose body registers a structural impact before his mind has determined exactly how to absorb it. He slowly recrossed his legs and adjusted the lapel of his gray suit jacket, minor, controlled presidential movements designed to signal complete composure to the surrounding cameras. Yet, the sum of those small physical adjustments revealed a distinct state of discomfort. For an executive as physically controlled as Barack Obama, that visible discomfort was monumental news. Gabbard carefully placed the declassified Department of Homeland Security memorandum into a separate folder on her right, initiating a physical stack of evidence that would expand continuously across the morning. She then reached back into the cardboard storage box, extracting a secondary file. This document was visibly thicker, consisting of several pages printed in full color, featuring what appeared to be 2 parallel historical timelines arranged side by side across the pages. Gabbard smoothed the colorful chart across the witness table. Document number 2, she announced to the committee, ensuring the charts faced the lens of the primary broadcast cameras. This analytic brief was compiled by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's Initiatives Group at my explicit direction. It represents a structured correlation analysis. She displayed the two-column document highlighting the multi-layered lines connecting dates across the page. Column 1 utilizes data extracted directly from the official White House visitor logs between the years 2010 and 2012, records that constitute an unalterable matter of public entry. It tracks the exact calendar dates of high-level consultations between senior executive political advisors and the leadership of the Internal Revenue Service. Column 2 records the precise dates on which new conservative civic organizations and political advocacy groups were officially added to the IRS Tax-Exempt Enhanced Scrutiny database. The specific targeting framework documented by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration in his subsequent 2013 investigative report. She traced her index finger down the intersecting lines of the color chart. Between March of 2010 and April of 2012, there were 14 distinct, unpublicized meetings conducted between executive political strategists and the senior leadership of the Internal Revenue Service inside the White House complex. Within a 14-day window of 11 of those 14 distinct consultations, the IRS Regulatory Division officially added new conservative political organizations to its internal targeting database. She raised her head, looking directly at the former president. 11 out of 14 distinct meetings correlate perfectly with immediate regulatory interventions, Mr. President. Barack Obama's right hand executed a minute physical movement. His hand shifted smoothly from his knee to the armrest of his gallery seat, his fingers subtly tightening around the polished wooden edge. He appeared entirely unaware that he was gripping the structure, but the surrounding camera lenses captured the visible whitening of his knuckles. I am currently the Director of National Intelligence. I am not a federal prosecutor, Gabbard stated, her voice maintaining its steady register. I understand completely that correlation does not automatically establish direct legal causation. But I can assert with absolute certainty, as an official whose entire professional life involves the forensic analysis of structural patterns within complex intelligence data, that an 11 out of 14 operational correlation between executive political consultations and regulatory targeting actions would immediately trigger a comprehensive counterintelligence investigation if detected inside any foreign government on this planet. She set the timeline document flat onto the growing stack of evidence. You sat across from national media interviewers in the year 2014 and confidently asserted to the American public that there was not even a smidgen of corruption operating inside the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. President, an 11 out of 14 intersection does not represent a smidgen of administrative irregularity. It represents a systematic operational blueprint. She paused, allowing the contrast to resonate. Inside the armed forces, we operate under a very basic analytical axiom. Once is an operational anomaly. Twice is a curious coincidence. 3 times represents direct enemy action. Your administration executed this pattern 11 separate times. Without hesitation, Gabbard reached back into the cardboard storage box, extracting a third dossier. A dense judicial folder bearing the official seal of the Department of Justice and containing an executive authorization framework. Document number 3, Gabbard stated. This is the official Department of Justice authorization mandate utilized to forensically seize the comprehensive telecommunications records of the Associated Press. Executed in May of 2012, this directive authorized the secret interception of 20 distinct corporate and personal phone lines, including residential numbers, cellular identifiers, and editorial desks utilized by more than 100 independent Associated Press journalists and editors. The telecommunications seizure was executed with 0 prior notification, 0 baseline negotiation, and in absolute violation of the department's own internal guidelines regarding media surveillance. Because this operation was initiated under the guise of an international national security leak investigation, the authorization remained classified under executive privilege. I have personally reviewed and authorized its partial declassification. She turned to a specifically highlighted addendum deep within the file. The structural body of this document consists of standard bureaucratic routing numbers, approval chains, and administrative surveillance tracking. But in the upper right margin, entered by hand rather than a word processor, are 6 specific words written by an administrative official. She read the text with absolute clarity. Per White House counsel, proceed without standard media notification. Approved at highest level. The House Judiciary hearing room fell into a state of shocked silence. It was not the attentive silence of an audience observing a political presentation, but the heavy, stunned silence of a legislative body processing a profound institutional revelation. Approved at highest level, Gabbard repeated, letting the words echo through the chamber. That is a handwritten executive directive scrawled onto a document that authorized the mass surveillance of over 100 independent American journalists working for a major international news agency. Mr. Chairman, I want to pose a non-rhetorical question directly to this committee. What specific administrative office occupies the tier immediately above the Attorney General of the United States? The question hung in the air for several seconds. No member of the majority caucus attempted an answer, as the institutional implications were immediate. And this did not represent an isolated intervention into the freedom of the domestic press, Gabbard continued, turning a page within the Department of Justice dossier. Your Department of Justice targeted James Rosen, a national security correspondent for Fox News. Federal agents forensically tracked his physical movements inside government facilities, obtained his private electronic correspondence, and explicitly categorized him as a criminal co-conspirator in an official federal court filing simply for executing his professional responsibilities as a journalist communicating with an administrative source. The former president's administration successfully prosecuted 8 individual government employees under the Espionage Act of 1917 for communicating factual information to members of the domestic press. To provide the proper historical context for this committee, from the administration of George Washington through the presidency of George W. Bush, the federal government had utilized that specific wartime statute against media sources a total of 3 times in 90 years. Barack Obama utilized it 8 times in 8 years, prosecuting more journalistic sources than every previous chief executive in the history of the United States combined. She extracted a secondary tracking sheet, reading the names directly into the congressional record to ensure they were permanently preserved in the oversight files. Thomas Drake, a senior executive within the National Security Agency who discovered massive structural waste and constitutional mismanagement, and reported those findings directly to congressional oversight committees. His career was systematically dismantled under a mountain of federal charges that were ultimately dropped to a minor misdemeanor. Shammai Leibowitz, a specialized Federal Bureau of Investigation translator who disclosed records of unlawful surveillance targeting a foreign diplomatic embassy, sentenced to 20 months in federal confinement. Stephen Kim, a State Department contract analyst who discussed a classified assessment regarding North Korean nuclear capabilities with a media correspondent, sentenced to 13 months. She continued down the list with clinical precision. Chelsea Manning, an Army intelligence analyst, sentenced to 35 years in military confinement for transferring data to a media platform. John Kiriakou, a career Central Intelligence Agency officer who became the first official to publicly confirm the existence of the agency's institutional waterboarding and enhanced interrogation programs to a journalist. He was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, becoming the solitary individual connected to the Central Intelligence Agency's post-9/11 interrogation programs to face incarceration, not for executing acts of physical torture, but for telling an American reporter that torture was an active state policy. Gabbard turned her body slightly to face the gallery rail. The individuals who physically administered the waterboarding were never indicted. The Department of Justice declined to file charges against a single interrogator. The executive lawyers who drafted the formal memos providing the pseudo-legal justification for those human rights violations walked free. The senior officials who oversaw the destruction of the videotaped evidence of those interrogations faced 0 legal consequences. The singular individual who was sent to a federal prison cell was the whistleblower who informed the public that the program existed. This was executed under your explicit executive authority by your hand-picked Attorney General operating inside your Department of Justice. What specific term would you deploy to define that paradigm? Obama leaned forward in his chair, placing his elbows precisely on his knees and interlacing his fingers. It was the iconic physical posture that corporate photographers had captured across his presidency inside the Situation Room, an image designed to project deep intellectual engagement. However, the physical reality was marked by a visible tightening of the tendons in his forearms, the skin stretching taut over his muscles. His senior foundation advisor leaned inward to whisper a strategic note. Obama offered a brief, automatic nod, but remained completely silent, his eyes fixed on the evidence table below, holding himself together under the weight of the records. Document number 4. The words immediately altered the collective focus of the room, not merely because of the designation, but because of the specific artifact Tulsi Gabbard removed from the storage container. It was a single page. Not a dense administrative report, a multi-layered chart, or a formal authorization form. It was a crisp photocopy of a handwritten log, preserving the exact alignment of the original pen strokes, margin annotations, and historical markers. This document represents a direct photocopy of Central Intelligence Agency Director John Brennan's personal handwritten briefing notes, generated during an official national security consultation inside the Oval Office on July 28, 2016. Gabbard announced. Barack Obama's physical posture shifted instantly. His back straightened against the gallery chair in a sharp, sudden movement. The distinct reaction of an executive recognizing the name of a highly classified archive he did not anticipate encountering on a live national television broadcast. A heavily redacted iteration of these notes was released to congressional oversight committees years ago, Gabbard explained, her voice remaining perfectly steady. The public is already entirely aware that Director Brennan briefed the executive regarding intercepted intelligence indicating that the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign had formally approved a strategic plan to vilify Donald Trump by manufacturing a public scandal, alleging deep ties to the Russian security services. That baseline context is a matter of established historical record. What has remained classified under the highest tiers of executive privilege until this morning, however, is your exact verbal response during that briefing. She raised the photocopy high, aligning it precisely with the primary line of media broadcast cameras. I will read Director Brennan's unredacted handwritten summary of your directive, word for word. The log records your response as follows. POTUS asked how confident. I said low confidence, source is highly partisan, chain of custody is indirect. POTUS stated proceed with caution, but do not shut down any investigative leads. Gabbard placed the unredacted record directly onto the primary evidence stack. Do not shut down any investigative leads. That is the definitive sentence that has been systematically concealed from the United States Congress, from public scrutiny, and from the courts for nearly a decade. Your administration classified it under national security markers. The subsequent administrative transition maintained that classification. It required the intervention of my office, the Office of a Director of National Intelligence you just characterized as unqualified, to finalize the declassification review and bring this text into the light. Her vocal delivery remained flat, carrying the clinical clarity of a formal military after-action report. Let us evaluate the empirical meaning of this record, Mr. Chairman. In July of 2016, the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency arrived in the Oval Office to inform the executive that a political campaign was actively manufacturing a deceptive narrative designed to implicate a presidential candidate in a treasonous foreign conspiracy. Brennan explicitly informed the president that the underlying intelligence behind this report was of exceptionally low confidence, derived from an intensely partisan source through an indirect chain of custody. The president's constitutional response was not to issue an immediate warning to the targeted campaign. His directive was not to alert the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court that subsequent warrant applications targeting American citizens might be rooted in a deceptive political operation. His instruction was not to immediately halt the utilization of federal intelligence architecture for domestic political interventions. The explicit directive of the president was, do not shut down any investigative leads. She turned her face to look directly back at Obama's position. Exactly 90 days following that consultation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation successfully obtained a comprehensive FISA surveillance warrant targeting Carter Page. A warrant rooted entirely in the assertions of the Steele dossier, the exact partisan material that your Central Intelligence Agency director had informed you was funded by the opposing political campaign. 4 months later, federal agents utilized a mandatory national security briefing of the incoming transition team as a clandestine intelligence gathering operation for Crossfire Hurricane, a domestic counterintelligence investigation that you knew was initiated under a political trick. You did not personally pull every domestic trigger, Mr. President, but you constructed the structural weapon, you loaded the operational ammunition, and you pointed it directly at a domestic political opponent. And when your intelligence chief explicitly asked for guidance, you ordered him to proceed. That does not constitute a protective shield. It represents a weapon of state surveillance. Obama's left eyebrow twitched upward, a fraction of an inch that represented the solitary physical break in his cultivated composure. It was the brief reaction of a public figure realizing that a sentence he assumed was permanently buried under the highest tiers of state classification had just been read aloud on a live national television broadcast. His senior advisor passed a handwritten note across the rail. Obama scanned the text, his masseter muscles flexing visibly beneath his skin as he clenched his teeth. He slowly folded the paper, placed it inside his suit pocket, and offered no response. "The final document, Mr. President," Gabbard stated, extracting a final printed sheet from the storage container. "This record does not carry classification markers. It is not derived from a sealed archive or a redacted intelligence file. It is derived directly from your own public addresses." She read the historical transcripts into the official record. March 29th, 2007. Campaign address in Washington, D.C. "When I occupy the office of the presidency, we will establish a government defined by absolute transparency and openness. We will actively fortify our whistleblower protection laws to insulate federal employees who expose systemic waste, institutional fraud, and the abuse of state authority." She paused, looking upward over her document. "You subsequently prosecuted 8 structural whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, more than every single chief executive in American history combined." She returned to the transcript text. October 2nd, 2008, National Presidential Debate. "We must recognize that we only maintain one president at any given time. We must never tolerate the utilization of the structural instruments of federal law enforcement or state intelligence power against domestic political opponents. Your intelligence chief explicitly briefed you that a political organization was manufacturing an international scandal to target your successor. Your directive was to ensure that no investigative leads were terminated." May 2018, address at Rice University. "Our administration did not sustain systemic scandals, a reality that should constitute a baseline standard rather than a point of personal boast." Gabbard placed the final page onto the completed evidence stack. "The audience laughed at that remark, Mr. President, because they believed your eloquence. They accepted the narrative because you delivered it with immense personal charm, precise physical timing, and a cultivated smile that made accepting the rhetoric significantly easier than examining the underlying administrative documents. I have completed a forensic review of those documents. I have examined every declassified file, every internal agency memo, every structural authorization, and every handwritten margin note. From the Quiet Skies memorandum that weaponized a terrorist tracking list to monitor my political commentary, to the IRS timeline showing an identical correlation between White House briefings and the targeting of civic organizations, to the Department of Justice media wiretaps marked approved at highest level, to Director Brennan's explicit Oval Office notes recording your directive to continue an investigation you knew was rooted in a partisan dirty trick. The record is absolute. You sustained massive institutional scandals, Mr. President. You simply possessed the oratorical skill to ensure the public looked away." The Rayburn chamber entered a state of quiet reflection, the profound silence that accompanies a definitive diagnosis rather than a sudden explosion. It was the reaction of an oversight body processing a long-suspected reality that had finally been stated plainly by an official possessing both the constitutional authority and the empirical documentation to establish it on the record. Obama kept his eyes fixed entirely on his hands, which were folded precisely in his lap with his fingers interlaced. The public leader who had maintained direct, confident eye contact with every international head of state, media interviewer, and political adversary for 30 years refused to raise his gaze to meet the witness or the committee dais. He stared downward at his own fingers like an artisan looking at an instrument he no longer possessed the ability to manage. His advisor touched his arm to offer a quiet consultation, but the former executive offered zero physical response. He remained entirely behind the mask of his composure, confronted with the immense structural distance between his public rhetoric and his covert administrative decisions. a distance measured in classified folders, handwritten directives, and the ruined careers of civil servants who had attempted to brief the public on the reality of the apparatus. Gabbard turned her focus back to the primary committee dais. Mr. Chairman, the former president stood before this rail and characterized my tenure as unqualified. He cracked my fitness to lead the intelligence community. I believe it is imperative to state clearly for this committee precisely why I am sitting in this chair. Her voice shifted away from the detached precision of the military register, adopting a deeply personal authority. I enlisted inside the Hawaii Army National Guard in 2003, 2 years following the destruction of September 11th. I was 21 years old. I watched the architectural towers collapse on a television screen inside my university dorm room, and I walked directly into a military recruitment facility 3 weeks later because I believed with absolute sincerity that when your nation is attacked by foreign adversaries, you have a moral obligation to serve. I deployed to an active combat zone in Iraq in 2004, operating with a medical unit attached to an artillery brigade, earning a combat medical badge while treating critically wounded soldiers, young individuals who were bleeding out in the dirt of a foreign theater. I deployed to Kuwait in 2008 as a military police officer. I subsequently served this nation inside the federal legislature for 8 years, occupying seats on both the Armed Services Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee. I made the conscious decision to resign from my executive position within the Democratic National Committee in 2016 because I observed that the primary process was structurally corrupt, and subsequent investigations validated that assessment. I exited the party entirely in 2022 because I concluded its leadership valued institutional power over foundational principles. And in 2024, the very government I had defended in uniform for over 2 decades placed my name on a terrorist watch list because I delivered a critical political assessment on a national television network. She stood up from the witness table, not with a theatrical flourish, but with the functional precision of a soldier reporting for duty. Her back was completely straight, her shoulders square, and her chin level with the dais. The former president constructed the precise administrative system that executed that weaponization, Gabbard declared, her voice echoing through the Rayburn room. He expanded the scope of the domestic surveillance state. His advisors coordinated the weaponization of the IRS against civic opposition. His Department of Justice monitored the telecommunications of the domestic press. His attorneys systematically prosecuted institutional whistleblowers. He was explicitly briefed that a political organization was manufacturing a treasonous conspiracy theory, and his direct instruction to his intelligence chief was to ensure the investigation was never shut down. And when his terms were concluded, while agency directors resigned, while journalistic phone records sat in federal databases, and while fraudulent FISA warrants were being presented to the courts, he stood in front of an audience and said, "I didn't have scandals." And the room laughed. She turned her body, looking directly at Obama's profile in the gallery section. It was the unyielding gaze of a soldier confronting a commanding officer on a matter of absolute duty. "I took a solemn constitutional oath upon my enlistment, Mr. President," Gabbard stated, her voice carrying a chilling finality. "It is the exact same oath that every soldier executes, that every member of this legislature executes, and that every chief executive takes before the nation, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. I kept my oath, Mr. President. Did you keep yours?" The former president offered no response. He was under no parliamentary mandate to do so, occupying a seat as a gallery guest rather than a subpoenaed witness. However, the question filled the chamber like heavy smoke, settling into every corner of the room until the very atmosphere felt transformed. Obama remained in his chair, his discipline preventing him from executing a sudden, defensive walkout that would immediately constitute the defining visual clip of the entire hearing. He kept his hands folded and his facial expression neutral, enduring the public reading of the 7 words he had classified 8 years prior, followed by a question he could not answer because every possible answer made the next day worse. He remained seated through the conclusion of the morning testimony. However, the intangible aura of absolute authority that he had carried into every room for 3 decades had completely vanished. What sat in the gallery chair was not the 44th President of the United States. It was a man in a gray suit with his hands folded and his eyes on the middle distance waiting for the hearing to end so he could stand and walk through a door. When the committee officially recessed for lunch 3 hours later, Obama rose from his chair. He walked across the gallery floor, intentionally bypassing the main double doors where the National Press Corps, television lights, and shouting reporters were waiting for post-hearing statements. Instead, he directed his steps toward the side staff exit, the unmarked door leading directly into a secure service corridor utilized by facility maintenance and members seeking to navigate the building outside public observation. His Secret Service detail executed a rapid, fluid pivot, adjusting their movements instantly to secure the modified route. The door closed behind them with a soft, institutional click. A solitary wide-angle pool camera positioned at the rear of the chamber caught the image. The charcoal jacket, the rapid movement toward the side exit, the closing of the unmarked panel, the empty gallery seat, and the hearing room that continued to operate as though the most powerful man who had ever sat in it had just left through the exit meant for people who carry things. The digital clip of Gabbard, reading John Brennan's unredacted briefing notes, was uploaded to networks at 12:17 p.m. By mid-afternoon, it had secured over 9 million views. However, the definitive viral phenomenon of the event was the 12-second video documenting his exit through the service door. Played side by side with footage of his triumphant morning entry, the video carried no music or editorial commentary, merely the visual reality of two completely different doors. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed 22 million times, transforming the phrase, "Did you keep yours?" into the dominant political tag across the country. A formal post-hearing statement was issued by an executive spokesperson at 4:30 p.m., asserting that the former president's comprehensive record spoke entirely for itself and that he would not dignify political theater with a direct response. Crucially, the communication offered zero factual denials regarding the unredacted CIA briefing notes, the IRS correlation chart, or the handwritten DOJ margin annotations. The institutional fallout accelerated with incredible velocity. Within 48 hours, the House Judiciary Committee voted to formally refer the 11 out of 14 IRS correlation timeline to the Public Integrity section of the Department of Justice for a formal criminal evaluation. Concurrently, federal attorneys initiated a preliminary review of the 2012 Associated Press telecommunications authorizations, focusing specifically on identifying the administrative source behind the handwritten margin note, approved at highest level. By the conclusion of the week, former Attorney General Eric Holder had retained independent criminal defense counsel separate from his established corporate legal representation. John Brennan issued a structured statement through his attorneys, asserting that his personal briefing notes constituted a precise, contemporaneous record of executive consultations conducted in absolute accordance with established security protocols. Legal analysts noted that by validating the accuracy of the record, his own legal team had formally authenticated the structural reality of the 7 words Gabbard had read aloud. The Department of Homeland Security Inspector General concurrently announced a comprehensive investigation into the internal authorization chain that had facilitated Director Gabbard's enrollment in the Quiet Skies tracking program. 3 veteran federal air marshal whistleblowers were formally summoned to deliver testimony before the Senate Homeland Security Committee. Their statements, delivered inside a closed executive session, detailed a systemic expansion of enrollment criteria dating back to 2010, revealing that the database had been continuously utilized to monitor individuals associated with political opposition movements or those who disseminated public criticisms of administrative policy. By the second week of June, a federal grand jury was officially convened inside the District of Columbia. According to unsealed docket entries, the scope of the inquiry explicitly covered the systemic abuse of federal surveillance authorities for domestic political objectives during the period spanning 2010 to 2017. The Obama Foundation announced an immediate pause on all public programming pending an internal organizational review, and former First Lady Michelle Obama canceled several national appearances without presenting an administrative explanation. Director Gabbard remained at the witness table for an additional 4 hours following the former president's departure, systematically responding to every legislative inquiry regarding intelligence restructuring, budgetary frameworks, and declassification protocols. When a minority member angrily accused her of transforming an oversight hearing into a venue for personal political vengeance, Gabbard adjusted her microphone. "Congressman, I have introduced 5 distinct records into the archive today. Gabbard noted calmly. 4 of those documents were generated entirely by the internal administrative offices of the United States government, by the Department of Homeland Security, the Internal Revenue Service Inspector General, the Department of Justice, and the Central Intelligence Agency. The 5th document represents a verbatim compilation of the former president's own public addresses. My office did not author these records. We did not fabricate these annotations. We simply located them within the archives, executed a rigorous declassification review, and read them into the public record. If reading the state's own official records before an oversight committee constitutes an act of vengeance, then the vengeance was committed by the people who created the records, not by the woman who read them. 600 miles away, inside the Carl R. Darnell Army Medical Center at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the home of the 101st Airborne Division, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb sat behind a standard laminate desk in a room designated for behavioral health walk-in services. The television monitor mounted to the wall was tuned directly to the live broadcast of the Rayburn proceedings. He had activated the audio feed at 10 a.m., and the small waiting area was occupied by 3 combat veterans sitting in plastic chairs along the opposite wall. 2 men and 1 woman dressed in civilian clothes, bearing the distinct, hyper-vigilant composure common to soldiers occupying administrative clinical spaces. Webb had served in the Iraqi theater during the 2004 rotation. While he operated with a different brigade than Gabbard, and had never crossed paths with her in theater, he recognized her structural cadence immediately. He understood her language, her physical posture, and the distinct manner in which she discussed national service without transforming it into a theatrical commodity. When the broadcast replayed the segment detailing her retention on the Quiet Skies watch list for criticizing administrative decisions on television networks, Webb looked across the waiting room. He observed the 12 empty chairs surrounding the 3 patients, knowing precisely why the facility routinely struggled with missed appointments and unreturned follow-up calls. He heard the exact same explanation delivered in various dialects every single week in the parking lots and clinic corridors. "I don't trust their databases," a young corporal had informed him the previous afternoon. "If I report what's actually happening inside my head, how do I know they won't enter a marker into my permanent federal file? How do I know the tools won't be used against me if the policy changes?" Webb turned his gaze back to the television screen, watching the unedited footage of the side service door closing behind the former chief executive. He recognized that the structural architecture of distrust had not been initiated by a single administrative decision, but had been methodically built through years of covert expansions, unchecked tracking systems, and the systemic targeting of whistleblowers who had attempted to notify the public of the reality. "She didn't back down from the rail," one of the waiting veterans remarked quietly from the back row, his eyes fixed on the image of the evidence stack. "She couldn't," Webb replied, returning his focus to his clinical charting notes. An officer who has managed a field triage unit in an active theater completely loses the ability to be intimidated by a charcoal suit. You know the exact difference between the noise of a speech and the weight of a factual record. The Rayburn surveillance audit concluded its initial session, but the systemic dismantling of the scandal-free narrative was permanently etched into the legislative files. The unredacted 7 words remained inside the congressional transcript, a permanent, document-based testament that eloquence can never permanently outrun the emergence of empirical evidence, and that the sacred nature of a constitutional oath eventually requires a factual accounting before the citizens it was sworn to protect.